As their ship entered Earth's solar system, Valthara looked at her own carefully prepared research proposal, complete with detailed methodology, expected outcomes, and contingency plans for various scenarios. She had documented everything. Maybe, she thought, the humans were already influencing her. The first thing that struck Zalamon about human laboratories was the noise. Not just the hum of equipment or the occasional beep of a timer, but the constant chatter of conversation. Researchers talked to each other constantly. They asked questions, shared observations, called colleagues over to look at unexpected results. It was chaotic and inefficient, he thought at first. On his homeworld, scientists worked in focused silence, disturbing others only when absolutely necessary. The second thing he noticed was the notebooks. Every researcher carried one, and they wrote in them constantly. Dates, times, observations, sketches, measurements, thoughts, questions. Everything went into the notebooks. When Zalamon asked his assigned mentor, Dr. Sarah Chun, about this practice, she looked at him with surprise. "If it's not written down, it didn't happen," Sarah said, as if this were obvious. "I might think I'll remember something, but I won't. Not accurately. Not after running 50 more experiments. So I write it down immediately." She flipped through her current notebook, showing him pages filled with neat handwriting interspersed with graphs, diagrams, and even small taped-in photographs. "See this entry from 3 months ago? I was trying to crystallize a protein. Failed 5 times. On the 6th attempt, I succeeded, but I didn't know why. So I went back through these notes, comparing what I did differently each time. Turned out the difference was temperature. The successful attempt happened on a cold day when the lab heating wasn't working properly. Would never have figured that out without the notes." Zalamon felt a stirring of understanding. On his world, such a failure would have been hidden, forgotten. The successful crystallization would have been reported as if it had worked on the first try. The knowledge that temperature mattered would have been lost. Over the next weeks, Zalamon observed Sarah's research group carefully. He watched as a graduate student named Narcus struggled with an experiment that kept producing inconsistent results. Marcus documented every attempt meticulously. After 2 weeks of failures, he presented his findings at the group's weekly meeting. Zalamon expected embarrassment or censure. Instead, the other researchers leaned forward with interest. They asked questions. Had Marcus checked the pH of his buffers? Yes, he had. Documented it every time. Had he controlled for the batch number of his reagents? Marcus checked his notebook. No, he hadn't thought of that. Different bottles might have slightly different concentrations. The next attempt, Marcus used reagents from the same batch. The experiment worked perfectly. He documented that finding immediately and sent an email to 3 other laboratories that were working on similar problems. "Heads up," he wrote. "Reagent batch variation matters for this protocol. Check your lot numbers." Within hours, he received thank you replies. One researcher reported that this explanation solved a problem she'd been fighting for weeks on his world. Zalamon thought Marcus would have been considered incompetent for struggling with the experiment. The solution would have been kept secret to maintain competitive advantage. Instead, Marcus had openly shared both his problem and his solution, and other scientists considered him helpful. Across the city, Dr. Valthara was having similar revelations at a large research university. She had been assigned to observe a laboratory studying infectious diseases. The principal investigator, Professor James Okafor, maintained what he called the Lab Bible, a massive shared digital notebook that every member of the laboratory contributed to. "Everything goes in here," James explained, showing her the system. "Protocols, recipes for solutions, where we keep equipment, how to troubleshoot common problems, who to contact for various services. When a new student joins the lab, they read the Bible. When someone discovers a trick that makes something work better, they add it to the Bible. When someone makes a mistake, they document it so others don't repeat it. Valthara watched as a postdoctoral researcher named Elena discovered that one of their protocols had a step in the wrong order. Rather than quietly fixing it, Elena updated the Bible with a note. Previous version had steps 4 and 5 reversed. This correction implemented on October 15th. Any experiments between August 3rd and October 15th may have been affected. See troubleshooting section for how to identify affected samples. Won't she be blamed for not catching this sooner? Valthara asked. James shook his head. She's being responsible by documenting it clearly. Now we know exactly what happened and when. We can go back and check if any important experiments were affected. If she'd hidden this or fixed it quietly, we might never have known why some of our earlier results seemed inconsistent. But what truly fascinated Valthara was the weekly journal club. Every Friday, the laboratory members gathered to discuss recently published papers from other research groups. They didn't just discuss successes. They actively looked for papers reporting negative results, failed replications, or experiments that hadn't worked as expected. "This paper is gold," Elena said one Friday, holding up her tablet. They tried to replicate a really popular finding and couldn't. They tested it 6 different ways and documented everything. This is going to save a lot of people from wasting time on a technique that doesn't actually work. The others nodded agreement. One asked, did they figure out why the original paper reported success? They think it might have been a statistical fluke. The original study had a small sample size. When you increase the sample size, the effect disappears. They suggest the original researchers probably weren't trying to deceive anyone, just got unlucky with their initial data. Valthara was astonished. On her world, publicly questioning another scientist's work would be considered deeply offensive. Here, it was considered a valuable service to the scientific community, and the humans did it respectfully, assuming honest mistakes rather than fraud. Meanwhile, in a completely different environment, team member Sorakel was observing something unexpected. She had been assigned to follow a group of amateur astronomers who gathered weekly in a field outside the city. They brought telescopes, cameras, and notebooks. They weren't professional scientists, yet they kept records as detailed as any research laboratory. Tom, a retired teacher who led the group, showed Sorakel his observation logs going back 30 years. "See this comet I spotted in 1995? I documented its position every night for 3 months. Professional astronomers who used my data, along with observations from hundreds of other amateurs, to calculate its orbit. I got listed as a contributor in the paper they published." He pointed to another entry. "This one's interesting too. I noticed a star that seemed to be varying in brightness irregularly. Documented it for a year before I mentioned it to a professional astronomer I know. Turns out it was being orbited by a planet. My observations helped confirm the discovery." Sorakel asked the question that had been puzzling her. "But you don't get paid for this? You're not trying to build a career?" Tom laughed. "No, I just love astronomy. But contributing to actual science, that's deeply satisfying. Knowing that my careful observations might help someone else make a real discovery, that's worth the cold nights and early mornings." The group's newest member, a teenager named Maya, was learning how to properly document her observations. An older member patiently showed her how to record seeing conditions, telescope settings, and precise times. "Details matter," he explained. "Someday someone might need to know exactly when you saw something and under what conditions. You want your notes to be useful." Sorakel realized she was witnessing something profound. These humans weren't documenting everything because they were required to. They did it because they wanted to contribute. They understood that their individual observations became valuable when combined with others. They were building something larger than themselves, back at the university. Valthara attended a conference that called itself Failure Fest. The name itself would have been scandalous on her world, but human scientists packed the auditorium. For 3 days, researchers presented their most spectacular failures. Experiments that had exploded. Hypotheses that proved completely wrong. Years of work that led to dead ends. But these weren't tales of shame. Each presentation carefully documented what had failed and why, what the researcher had learned, and how others might avoid the same pitfalls. The audience took notes frantically. During breaks, attendees clustered around presenters, asking detailed questions about the failures. One presenter, Dr. Lisa Wu, described 5 years of work trying to develop a new cancer treatment. She had exhausted 3 different approaches. None had worked. She was abandoning the project, but she wanted others to learn from her experience. During the question period, someone asked, "Do you regret spending 5 years on this?" Lisa thought for a moment. "I regret that I couldn't help patients sooner, but I don't regret the work. I learned enormous amounts. I can now tell other researchers that these 3 approaches probably won't work and why. Maybe that will save someone else 5 years. Maybe they'll use what I learned to try a 4th approach. I hadn't thought of science as cumulative." The chamber fell silent as Dr. Valthara displayed the data on the central screen. Around her, representatives from 43 different species stared at the information with expressions ranging from confusion to outright disbelief. The Galactic Scientific Council had convened emergency sessions before, but never for something quite like this. "I must be misunderstanding the translation," said Counselor Mextar, his 3 eyes blinking in sequence. "You're saying the humans document their failures?" "Not just their failures," Valthara replied, her voice steady despite the murmurs rippling through the assembly. "They document everything. Every step of every experiment, every measurement, every observation, every mistake." She pulled up another file, and the screen filled with what appeared to be a human scientific paper. "Look at this section here. They call it Materials and Methods. It describes exactly how they conducted their research. Every detail. What equipment they used, what temperature the room was kept at, how many times they repeated each test, what went wrong during the trials." Counselor Urath leaned forward, his scales shimmering under the chamber lights. Why would they do this? If another researcher learns their exact methods, they could replicate the work. They could claim the discovery as their own. "That's exactly what they want," Valthara said. "They want others to replicate their work. They call it reproducibility. They consider it essential to their scientific process." The chamber erupted in confused chatter. Across the galaxy, research methods were closely guarded secrets. A scientist's techniques were their most valuable asset, passed down only to chosen apprentices or sold to the highest bidder. The idea of freely sharing such information seemed absurd. Valthara waited for the noise to die down before continuing. "There's more. Humans have created entire journals dedicated to publishing failed experiments. They have databases where researchers share results that didn't work. They even hold conferences where scientists present their biggest mistakes to help others avoid the same problems. This must be a less advanced civilization," suggested Dr. Kelcher from the back of the chamber. "Perhaps they haven't learned the value of proprietary knowledge yet." "That's what I thought at first," Valthara admitted. She changed the display again, this time showing a graph. "But look at their rate of scientific advancement. In the 300 cycles since they developed their modern scientific method, they've progressed from basic chemistry to quantum computing, from understanding simple genetics to editing their own DNA, from ground-based telescopes to exploring their neighboring planets." She let that information sink in. 300 cycles was nothing. Most species took thousands of cycles to achieve similar progress. It gets stranger, Valthara continued. I access their academic networks. Human researchers post their work before it's even been formally reviewed. They share their data openly. They publish their experimental protocols online for anyone to use. I found laboratory notebooks from scientists who died 200 cycles ago, preserved in museums and libraries. Anyone can read them. Councilor Mexstar made a sound of distress. But the knowledge loss when a master researcher dies is one of our greatest challenges. We spend years trying to recreate techniques that died with their creators. Exactly, Valthara said. Humans don't lose that knowledge. It's all written down. Every technique, every trick, every small adjustment that makes an experiment work. Graduate students write theses that explain their research in exhaustive detail. Principal investigators maintain laboratory notebooks that record daily activities. Field researchers keep logs with photographs, measurements, and observations about everything from equipment problems to weather conditions. She pulled up another example. Look at this. A human researcher spent 3 months trying to synthesize a particular compound. She failed repeatedly. Most species would hide this embarrassment, but she published a paper about it. She described every approach she tried, why each one failed, and what she learned from the failures. Do you know what happened next? The council waited. 17 other research teams cited her paper. They thanked her for saving them months of wasted effort. One team used her information to figure out a successful synthesis method, and they cited her as having contributed to their breakthrough. Dr. Kelscher stood up. I don't understand. If she failed, how did she contribute to a breakthrough? Because she documented what didn't work, Valthara explained. In human science, negative results are still results. Knowing what fails is nearly as valuable as knowing what succeeds. Sometimes more valuable because it helps narrow down the possibilities. She switched to another display, showing what looked like a massive database. This is something they call GitHub. It's where human researchers share computer code. Not just finished programs, but works in progress. Others can download this code, modify it, improve it, and share their improvements. It's all free, all open. I found climate modeling software used by research institutions across their planet, built by thousands of contributors, available to anyone. But who gets credit? Asked a small voice from the left side of the chamber. Who owns the discovery? That's the fascinating part, Valthara said. They have a different concept of credit. Yes, they acknowledge the lead researcher or the person who had the key insight. But they also acknowledge everyone who contributed along the way. Human scientific papers have sections called acknowledgments, where they thank people who helped, even in small ways. They cite dozens, sometimes hundreds of previous papers that informed their work. They build on each other's research openly and proudly. Councilor Rath's scales had shifted to a darker color, a sign of deep thought. But surely their corporations don't operate this way. Surely business interests require secrecy? Some do, Valthara conceded. But even in their corporate laboratories, documentation is extensive. They maintain detailed records because they've learned that undocumented knowledge walks out the door when employees leave. And many human companies have started to embrace open innovation, sharing certain discoveries because they've found that collaboration accelerates progress faster than secrecy. She paused, then added, and there's something else. Something I find even more remarkable. Human documentation extends beyond professional researchers. They have what they call citizen scientists, amateur enthusiasts who make observations and keep careful records. Bird watchers who document species populations over decades. Weather enthusiasts who maintain private weather stations and share their data. Patient groups who track their symptoms and share information about diseases. Amateurs? Counselor Maxstar looked scandalized. They let untrained individuals contribute to scientific knowledge. They don't just let them, Belthara said. They encourage it. And these amateur contributions have led to real discoveries. A birdwatcher's 40-year journal helped human scientists track climate change effects on migration patterns. A patient forum where people shared their medication experiences led to the discovery of a dangerous drug interaction that professional researchers had missed. She brought up a final image. It showed a human laboratory, walls lined with notebooks, computers humming with stored data, researchers clustered around a whiteboard covered in notes and diagrams. This is what human science looks like. Messy, collaborative, transparent, everything documented, everything shared, nothing hidden. And you believe this approach is superior to our methods? Counselor Urath asked, his tone skeptical but curious. I believe it's worth studying, Belthara replied carefully. Humanity has been part of the galactic community for less than 10 cycles, yet they've already made contributions to xenobiology, quantum mechanics, and material science. Their rate of innovation is extraordinary. We need to understand why. The council deliberated for several minutes before Counselor Mextar spoke again. What do you propose? Valthara had been hoping for this question. I request permission to lead a research team to Earth. We'll embed ourselves in their research institutions. Universities, laboratories, field research stations. We'll observe their methods firsthand. We'll learn how this culture of documentation actually works in practice. And if we discover that their methods truly are superior, asked Dr. Kelcher, what then? Then we'll have to decide if we're willing to change, Belthara said simply. Change how we conduct research. Change how we share knowledge. Change how we think about scientific progress. The vote was close, but eventually the council approved her proposal. Belthara would take a team of 6 researchers from different species and different scientific disciplines to Earth. They would spend a full cycle observing human research methods. They would document everything they learned. The irony of that last thought wasn't lost on her. To understand why humans documented everything, they would need to document everything themselves. Perhaps, she thought as she left the chamber to assemble her team, they were already beginning to learn from humanity's approach. 3 weeks later, Belthara and her team boarded a transport bound for Earth. Each team member carried recording equipment, translation devices, and the authorization to observe human researchers in their natural environment. They had no idea that what they would learn would change galactic science forever. My failures become part of the foundation others build on. The audience applauded. Belthara found herself applauding too. That evening, she gathered her team to share observations. Each had similar stories. Humans documented everything, shared freely, built on each other's work, and treated failures as valuable data rather than shameful secrets. I think I'm beginning to understand, Zalomon said slowly. It's not that individual human scientists are so much smarter than us. It's that they've created a system where knowledge accumulates and flows freely. They don't lose information when someone retires or dies. They don't waste time repeating each other's mistakes. Every human researcher stands on a mountain of documentation created by everyone who came before them. It's like they have a collective memory, Soracle added. The whole species learns together. Belthara nodded. And that's why they advance so quickly. They're not smarter. They're better at preserving and sharing knowledge. Every generation starts from a higher point because nothing is lost. She looked at her own notes, now filling multiple notebooks of her own. She had adopted the human practice without consciously deciding to. It just made sense. Write it down. Share it. Let others build on it. The question is, she said, Will the Galactic Council believe us? And if they do, will they be willing to change? Her team fell silent. Change was difficult. The current system benefited established researchers and prestigious institutions. Openness would disrupt power structures that had existed for millennia, but Valthara had seen enough. The humans were right. Science progressed faster when everyone contributed and everyone shared. The galaxy had much to learn from this young species that documented everything. She just hoped she could convince the council before pride and tradition stood in the way of progress. Part 3. The message reached them during their 4th month on Earth. Outbreak of hemorrhagic fever had appeared in the outer colonies, spreading rapidly across multiple species. The pathogen was unlike anything the galactic medical databases had encountered. Hundreds were sick. Dozens had died. The Galactic Scientific Council needed every available xenobiologist working on the problem immediately. Valthara's team prepared to return, but the humans surprised her. Within hours of learning about the outbreak, Dr. James Okafor had contacted his colleagues across Earth. By the next morning, 15 human research groups had volunteered to help. They had no stake in galactic politics. They barely knew these alien species. But people were dying, and they were scientists. That was enough. We'll need to share data constantly, James told the assembled researchers on a video call. I'm setting up a shared database. Everyone uploads their protocols, their results, their observations, everything. Positive results, negative results, weird results. If you see something odd, document it immediately and flag it for others. One researcher asked, "What about publication rights? Who gets credit for a breakthrough?" James didn't hesitate. "We'll worry about that after people stop dying. Right now, we work together. Agreed?" Everyone agreed. Valthara and her team returned to the Galactic Science Institute, where the council had assembled their most prestigious researchers. Each team worked in isolated laboratories, as was traditional. Information was tightly controlled. Preliminary findings were kept secret until they could be verified and published. The researchers were brilliant, each a master of their field, and they were moving too slowly. Valthara watched with growing frustration as days passed. The Kryn team had developed a promising approach, but refused to share details until they had confirmed their results. The Zentari researchers had found something interesting about the pathogen structure, but were keeping it confidential. The Uriel investigators had attempted 3 different treatment approaches, but only reported the ongoing 3rd attempt. No one knew about the 2 failures. Meanwhile, on Earth, the humans worked in their chaotic, transparent way. Their shared database updated constantly. A team in Beijing posted a failed drug combination with detailed notes about why it hadn't worked. A laboratory in Lagos uploaded microscope images showing how the pathogen interacted with different cell types. Researchers in Sao Paulo shared a protocol for rapidly testing potential treatments, including the troubleshooting steps they had figured out. Zaman, monitoring both efforts, saw the difference clearly. The galactic researchers were protecting their territory. The human researchers were sharing their territory. On the 8th day, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Chen's laboratory had been testing various antiviral compounds without success. She documented each failure carefully, noting observations about how the pathogen responded to different treatments. One compound had produced a strange result. The pathogen didn't die, but its replication rate slowed oddly. Sarah considered not mentioning it. The result wasn't conclusive. It might just be experimental error. But she remembered what James had said. Everything goes in the database. She uploaded her observation with a note. Probably nothing, but Compound 7 produced weird effects on replication. See attached data. Anyone else seeing anything similar? 3 hours later, a Kryn researcher named Felrix sent her a message. He had been part of Velthara's original observation team and had learned human methods. He was back at the Galactic Institute, but was secretly monitoring the human database. "Your compound 7, he wrote. "We saw something similar with a completely different approach. Our team is keeping it quiet because we don't understand it yet. But if I compare your data with ours, there's a pattern. The pathogen's outer protein structure is changing in response to stress. Both our approaches are causing the same structural change." Sarah immediately shared this with her team and posted it to the database. Within an hour, a researcher in Mumbai had an insight. If the protein structure changes under stress, maybe we're approaching this wrong. Instead of trying to kill the pathogen directly, what if we force it into that stress state and then hit it with something that specifically targets the changed structure? The idea spread through the network instantly. Teams on Earth and a few galactic researchers who were quietly following the human database began testing combinations. A laboratory in Stockholm tried forcing the structural change with one compound, then applying another. It showed promise. They documented everything and shared immediately. A Zentari researcher, frustrated with his institution's slow progress, secretly accessed the human database and saw the Stockholm results. He tried a variation using a compound available to Zentari physiology. It worked even better. He knew he should report through official channels, but people were dying while his superiors deliberated about publication rights. He broke protocol and shared his findings directly with the human network. Now they had a framework. Force the pathogen into a stress state, then attack the changed structure. Different species needed different specific compounds, but the approach was universal. Teams began developing species-specific treatments based on the shared methodology. Velthara watched this unfold with a mixture of triumph and horror. Triumph because the collaborative approach was working. Horror because it highlighted how badly the traditional galactic approach was failing. She requested an emergency session with the council. This time, she didn't just present data. She showed them the two approaches side by side. The isolated galactic teams working brilliantly but slowly. The collaborative human network sharing everything and accelerating toward a solution. Thelrix broke protocol, Counselor Mexstar said severely. He shared confidential research with an outside network. Thelrix saved lives, Velthara countered. His observation, combined with human data, led directly to the breakthrough. That combination wouldn't have happened if everyone had kept their findings secret until they were ready to publish. But the chaos, Counselor Urath protested. Everyone's seeing unverified results, half-formed ideas, failed experiments. It's undisciplined. It's effective, Velthara said firmly. She pulled up the database statistics. In 10 days, the human network has conducted 247 experiments, tested 89 different compounds, and documented every single result. They've tried approaches that didn't work and shared why. They've built on each other's successes and learned from each other's failures. Our traditional teams have been more disciplined, more careful, more thorough. And they're weeks behind. Dr. Kelcher, who had been silent until now, spoke quietly. How many lives has the delay cost? The chamber fell silent. Everyone knew the answer. Hundreds now. Maybe thousands if the outbreak wasn't contained soon. The humans have a saying, Velthara continued. They say that science is a collaborative effort, that they stand on the shoulders of giants. But it's more than that. They stand on the shoulders of everyone who came before them. Not just the giants. The graduate students who documented their failed experiments. The amateur enthusiasts who kept careful logs. The researchers who published negative results. Every single documented observation, success or failure, becomes part of the foundation. She gestured to her team, standing behind her. We spent 4 months on Earth, We documented what we learned. Every one of us has adopted human practices because we saw how well they work. Zalman now maintains detailed lab notebooks. Soracle shares her preliminary findings with colleagues immediately. Thelrix broke your protocol because he knew the human approach would save lives faster. You're asking us to change everything, Counselor Mexstar said. Millennia of tradition. The entire structure of how we conduct science. I'm asking you to save lives, Velthara replied, and to advance knowledge faster. The humans figured this out centuries ago. They learned that hiding knowledge slows progress. They learned that sharing failures prevents others from repeating mistakes. They learned that collaboration accelerates discovery. She pulled up one final image. It showed a human research laboratory with its walls of notebooks, its open workspaces, its researchers clustered together sharing observations. This is what human science looks like. Messy, open, collaborative. Everything documented. Everything shared. They aren't smarter than us. They are more advanced. They've just built a better system for accumulating and sharing knowledge. The debate lasted for hours. Established researchers worried about losing competitive advantages. Prestigious institutions feared losing their status. Traditional scientists insisted that careful, methodical, private research was more reliable than chaotic collaboration. But the outbreak continued, and the human approach continued to outpace the traditional galactic approach. Finally, Counselor Urath's scales shifted to the deep purple of decision. I propose a trial period. Voluntary at first. Institutions that wish to adopt human documentation and sharing practices may do so. We'll evaluate the results. It wasn't the full transformation Velthara hoped for, but it was a beginning. The vote passed. Within days, younger researchers flocked to the new system. They set up shared databases, opened laboratory notebooks, and preprint servers. Established scientists grumbled, but couldn't argue with results. Research that had been stalled for years suddenly accelerated as information flowed freely. The outbreak was contained within a month. The collaborative effort, combining galactic and human research, had developed effective treatments for all affected species. When time came to publish the findings, the author list included 247 researchers from 17 species across 42 institutions. No one argued about who deserved the most credit. They had worked together. Everyone contributed. 2 years later, Velthara stood in the same council chamber where she had first presented her findings about human documentation practices. The changes had been profound. The Galactic Science Institute now maintained open databases. Research protocols were shared freely. Failed experiments were published and celebrated for the knowledge they provided. Graduate students were taught to document everything. Some traditionalists still resisted. Some institutions still clung to the old ways. But the momentum was clear. The galaxy was learning what humanity had learned centuries before. Science progressed faster when knowledge flowed freely. Dr. Velthara, Counselor Mexstar said, his tone much warmer than it had been at that first meeting. Your research team has been nominated for the Council's highest honor. Your documentation of human scientific practices has transformed our approach to research. Velthara accepted the honor, but she knew the truth. She hadn't transformed anything. She had simply documented what humans were already doing and shared those observations with others who were ready to learn. That evening, she returned to her laboratory and opened her notebook. She dated the entry carefully and began to write. Old habits from her time on Earth. Everything written down. Everything documented. Everything preserved for whoever came next. She wrote about the ceremony, the recognition, the changes spreading across the galaxy. But she also wrote about the resistance, the challenges, the institutions still clinging to old ways. Someday, someone might want to know the full story. Not just the successes, but the struggles. In another part of the institute, Zalman was teaching a class of young researchers. "Write it down," he told them, repeating the phrase Sarah Chun had taught him years before. "If it's not documented, it didn't happen." Your observations, successful or not, might be exactly what someone else needs to make a breakthrough. The students nodded and bent over their notebooks, documenting their first experiments. Some would fail. Some would succeed. All would be recorded, shared, and built upon. On Earth, James Okafor received a message from Velthara. She thanked him for his laboratory's participation in fighting the outbreak. She told him about the changes happening across the galaxy. She mentioned that his simple practice of maintaining the lab Bible had inspired similar practices in dozens of galactic research institutions. James smiled and added Velthara's message to his laboratory's shared notebook. Someone might find it interesting someday. Everything documented, everything shared, everything preserved. In the end, humanity's greatest contribution to galactic civilization wasn't a specific technology or discovery. It was a simple idea, so obvious that most humans never even thought about it consciously. Write it down. Share it. Let others build on it. The galaxy was finally learning what humanity had known all along. Science wasn't about individual genius or jealously guarded secrets. It was about collaboration, accumulation, and the patient documentation of everything learned along the way. The humans had documented everything. And in teaching the galaxy to do the same, they had changed the course of scientific history forever.